I think that this is a really, really cool opportunity to react to the culture in that we are seeing a world that is really suffering, and we have the only message that will get rid of that, or that can combat that, and that can really shine a light into this loneliness. And I think there's this interesting duality of the answer being us, but also the answer being God. And it is all God, but it is also we're the only ones who are going to create communities that people can come into and realize that they're not alone.
Welcome everybody to the Shock Absorber podcast once again here at the Third Space Studios in Sorovolvo, Kirrawee, and it's excellent to have you along with us. It's excellent to have a couple of other people along with me today. We are talking about culture in the 2010s and 2020s. How we minister in that and whether we embrace or critique culture. Now, we had Ian Hussey on last episode, and he was talking about Australian culture because that's where the majority of his research is in. So we took inspiration for this season of looking at culture through the lens of some artists that, in particular, the YouTube channel Polyphonic likes to looks at culture and how they shaped culture. But because we had Ian Hussey on and he talks about Australian culture, we thought we would start looking at Australian artists to help describe Australian culture and whether we should embrace or critique it. And to do that with me, I have two pastors from Sorovolvo Church. First of all, I have Brayden.
Hello.
Student pastor of Sorovolvo Church. How are you?
I'm good.
You have made appearance prior.
Yeah, I have been the speaking voice.
You were the voice on the David Bowie episode, I believe.
Yeah.
So, check that out if you're keen on checking that out about David Bowie. And also Ethan Crawshaw.
Hello.
Youth pastor, Sorovolvo Church.
That's me.
Feeling well? Feeling good?
Excited.
Good to be
voice
here.
On the Kanye.
Yeah, I was the voice on Kanye.
Yes, you were on the Kanye episode, and you gave us lots of detailed information about Kanye and Ye. He's now known as Ye, but yes. Yep. But no more American artists for the moment. No. We're going to be talking about Australian artists, and the artist we've chosen for today is a very influential artist in the last probably 10 years, and that was by the name of, the band's name is Tame Impala. Brayden, you have a lot of experience and knowledge of Tame Impala, given that they were one of your favourite bands in high school, I believe. Who is Tame Impala, and is it one guy or many guys?
I think it's an interesting one. So Tame Impala is a band, I guess, but it's also one person. So Kevin Parker is the, artist behind Tame Impala. He writes, records all the music by himself. Obviously, when he plays live, he brings along his friends, and they play with him. So it's kind of like Kevin Parker is Tame Impala, but then he hires his friends to play live when they need to do a live show, which is like a very interesting concept. But it's actually it's not a heaps new thing. I think it's become more prevalent with more accessibility. I'm sure we'll talk about to being able to record things more easily by yourself. So the bands like there's a band called City and Colour, which is a Canadian group that is the same kind of thing, where Dallas Green writes all the music and then tours with a live band. Or even the first Foo Fighters album, Dave Grohl recorded and played every instrument on. It's the same kind of concept, and it's an interesting concept. And I think it's going to be fun to talk about the different aspects of being a band and presenting yourself as a band, because that's kind of a statement as well. Like you're not just presenting music under your own name, you're presenting music under a moniker. That's a choice, and it's a choice of how you're presenting yourself. And it's also, what does that entail? Like, can you build more of a myth around a band than you can around just using your own name? I think there's a lot of interesting choices that go into something like that. But I definitely, it's such an interesting choice. I feel like I definitely reflects a lot of a new avenue for people who are creating things. It's not just you. You can build something bigger and present it as a whole vision, which I think is something we're going to get into a little bit with Kevin, and the way that he likes to control the whole vision, and the way he can meticulously bring it together by himself and present exactly what he wants. I think that's an interesting aspect of their music. But yeah, just personally, I think reflecting on this after Joel asked if I wanted to be a part of this podcast earlier in the week, I was listening to another podcast, which is a podcast called Who is Daniel Johns?
Oh, yeah.
And it's very popular at the moment in Australia. It's a podcast, talking about Daniel Johns from Silverchair, not just
the singer and guitarist of Silverchair.
Yeah, right? Who's so not just his work in Silverchair, but across his life. And I thought it was very interesting. It just so happened I was listening to that this week, and the first episode, the first person they interview for that is Kevin Parker.
Oh, wow!
And he talks about the fact that as someone who was young in the 90s growing up, and he was growing up, he was born in Sydney, but he grew up in Perth. Like, he's most commonly known for being a big part of the WA music scene.
Which is a little like, just like Perth, a little bit isolated, but like it's its own scene, right?
Yeah, it really became its own thing, especially with Tame Impala and Pond and Gum and a whole bunch of associated acts, the Growls and stuff, who are all friends and all play in each other's bands, which is another fun thing. But so Kevin was talking about how Silverchair for him was so inspiring because he was going, wow, these are some dudes in Newcastle. So not even, they're from New South Wales, but they're not from Sydney. These are some dudes from Newcastle that became rock stars, basically, that created something like Frog Stomp that was so big and influential that it didn't matter that they weren't from Sydney. It didn't matter that they're only 15 years old.
Yeah. They
broke through. And he actually talked about how he was 13 and he was like, oh, I've only got 2 years left. I've only got 2 years left to make my Frog Stomp.
Yeah.
But I think that really resonated with me because especially as someone growing up playing guitar in high school, when you start playing guitar, you start learning AC/DC and Guns N' Roses, all this guitar-based music. I think it was so influential to see this band from Australia playing at the start. Obviously he changes his sound and we'll get into that a bit later, but at the start playing guitar-based music, playing music that, like, you wouldn't say that 60s, like influenced by the 60s psychedelic rock would be the biggest Australian band, would end up being the biggest Australian band of the 2010s. I don't think anyone would have predicted that. But seeing someone playing the music that he wanted to play, the way he wanted to play it, and also breaking through that, and also doing it himself, like, so self-produced, having control, being able to do it at home and playing guitar-based music from Perth. I think what he describes with Daniel Johns and seeing Silverchair and being like, man, we can do it, is the same way that I think lots of, at least my friends who were playing music, felt about Tame Impala. We felt like, wow, these are the dudes from Australia who are killing it. Like, they ended up headlining Coachella.
So you saw them as relatable.
Yeah, like, relatable, but also like, yeah, it made it feel achievable.
Yeah,
because I think it's pretty easy to just go, wow, I wasn't born, like, I'm not in London. I'm not in, and even though we are in Sydney, which is pretty cool and pretty massive, yeah, it's pretty easy to be like, well, I'm not in America, I'm not in London, like we can't do anything.
I'm not going to get picked up by a label.
Like the last five, it's not even like, it's just the last five artists we've spoken about of all, I think it's one English person and 4 Americans. It's kind of easy to just be like, well, that's the hub of culture. Yeah. That's where we get culture from, is from those, is from other countries, from America or from England. I think it's...
it's like, you're saying it's relatable. It's almost like, well, we can have an impact on culture because Tame Impala are.
Yeah.
That's what's interesting. And like, it's even when we spoke about David Bowie in the first episode of this season, one of the questions that David Bowie was asked in the Rolling Stone was, what instrument would you pick up now? And he said, a computer.
Yeah.
And that has a computer is what has allowed Kevin of Tame Impala to create a gigantic, he likes that wall of sound type of music.
Yeah.
He's able to create that by using a computer. He can record a bass line and then loop it and then he can record the drums over the top of that and loop that, and then he can do all that kind of stuff in terms of creating an album in order to, which then we'll bring in guys later, but I can control this whole project myself and then put it out to a wider audience rather than, we got to just keep. It's a sign of the times, I think, because it's and possibly the internet, because he started putting his music out on MySpace, and that's where he first got recognized. But it's a sign of the times, is that even when you think about going back to 50s and 60s and 70s rock, for example, you had to tour and tour and tour and tour and tour. I remember, because I'm a big fan of AC/DC, and reading, they would do 3 shows a night in Sydney.
Yeah.
I don't know. I wonder if Kevin did 3 shows. I don't know if he did. You still got a tour to get your work out there, but being able to record your stuff and put it out there doesn't mean you have to tour and hope some A&R guy from a record label recognizes you.
That's the big thing as well. We started this conversation by talking about Tame Impala. Are they a band? Is it an artist? Yeah. That's the other. You don't even have to. You used to have to find a drummer.
Yep.
Yeah. Find a singer. And he did, he obviously has employed his friends to play live, but he didn't do that before he recorded the first album.
Yeah.
So you don't even need to make friends, I guess. Not reflecting anything on Kevin, because he's obviously a very popular part of that music scene. But that's the messaging you're getting. Like, hey, if you're talented enough to put this stuff together, and he is very talented, you don't need anyone else. You just need a laptop, as you just said, with as David Bowie mentioned, which is so interesting and such a different way of thinking about the concept of a band and the concept of making music.
It's like make music first, then get a band.
Yeah.
When the other way around for a lot of years and years has been get a band, then make music, and then get recognized.
Yeah, exactly.
He's almost flipped it on its head.
Yeah.
Which is quite interesting. Ethan, before we move on to perhaps talking about some of those themes, I feel like we're pulling out some of those things that we also relate to what Ian Hussey's been talking about, is individualism, and then also loneliness and how that can lead to anxiety and depression.
As we start talking about what Kevin actually sings about.
Yeah, exactly.
Actual content.
Any thoughts about Tame Impala before we get into that?
I was sharing with Brayden that I have tried really hard to get into Tame Impala, and because I'm like, all the cool kids are in it, into it, and it is not sank in at all for me, unfortunately. Not for lack of trying. Yeah. But I think I've listened to most of the discography, but I've just been like, pretty.
That's an interesting thing you've said there, because Joel and I were chatting to a friend this morning.
A big fan of Tame Impala.
Yeah, but what was his comment? I think he wrote it down about Tame Impala, talking about not being one of the cool kids is one of their...
Yeah, one of the things that Kevin writes about is not being one of the cool people.
Yeah.
And in terms of, I'm not going to be... It's almost like I don't want to be one of the cool people, but I can still be an individualist. Yeah. I can still do whatever I want. And again, I think this is something that we need to talk a lot about in the Shock Absorber going forward, is the internet. Yeah. And the internet, I think we are living through the next industrial revolution of the internet, and how it changes how we communicate, how bands like Tame Impala get recognised. For example, Justin Bieber was recognised through MySpace. Scooter Braun found him in MySpace and said, this guy's great. And then Justin Bieber's one of the biggest pop stars in the world.
Yeah, but it's also just so interesting how, and I think this goes for the grunge movement and Nirvana as well, how you can sing about being so lonely and isolated and not feeling not part of the cool culture, and how that can resonate with so many people and become the popular culture, being anti the popularist stuff that's going on,
like celebrity culture.
Yeah,
kind
exactly.
of like
But he's become the popular culture by speaking out about how the popular culture makes him feel isolated.
Yeah, and that the popular culture is possibly only like what is presented as the elite few. That's that celebrity culture thing. Is like, oh, you can't be like us, but you can idolize us. You can be like this. So it's almost like in the 2010s, there was a big focus on Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie and all that kind of thing. But it's almost like Kevin has recognize that and say, I feel I can still be an individual, but I don't have to follow this celebrity culture. And then, but by being anti-institutional, another thing that we've talked about before.
Yeah.
I can flip that and actually speak to a wider range of people, because that's actually how they feel with those kind of things, like
He's
celebrity
critiquing
culture.
what they're presenting and saying how it makes him feel lonely and isolated and like obscure. But then all these other people are resonating with that critique and how they feel as well. It's such an interesting concept to almost be like, oh yeah, I feel lonely as well. Like, but together, it's such an interesting.
Also,
concept.
a perfect time to talk about it with, especially in Australia, of the at least 2 COVID lockdowns in Sydney, for example. There was more in
Melbourne. Had it worse.
Melbourne had more.
Worse.
WA, for example, have isolated themselves even more. Like, I mean, most of WA is desert, and then you just have the coast most of the time, and so that creates perhaps the WA music scene that we're talking about. It's a little bit different, a little bit into psychedelic music a lot.
Well, like, how long does it take to fly to Melbourne from Sydney? Like
an hour and a half.
Hour and a half. And is what, 6 to 8 hours to get to Perth?
No,
like
it'll be shorter than that. It's usually 4 to 5. I think,
that's heat. 12 hours. nine hours to get to Perth.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Like, perhaps because it's an isolated area, and then so Kevin, growing up in that area, feels isolated from the rest of the world.
Yeah,
celebrity culture 2010s. Well, I'm going to talk about, like, his parents broke up, I believe, when he was 3.
Yeah.
And then he went to move somewhere else and live with his dad and his stepmother, occasionally with his sister.
Yeah.
And those kind of things perhaps influence his music a lot. And like, even his 2012, his second album, right, 2012, I believe, Lonerism, is like, it's called Lonerism because like he's really calling on that. Heath, what do you reckon, like, with COVID-19, being a youth pastor, how do you think that has affected this kind of age group, where we've talked about how Tame Impala was really influential when, Brayden, when you were finishing high school? How do you think, like, that loneliness or perhaps feeling lonely, you might not be lonely, but you feel lonely, how does that, what are you kind of reading from youth culture, and how do we perhaps look at that and listen to that and embrace or critique it?
I think one of the really interesting points that was raised was the fact that Brayden said that this guy, Kevin, was talking about loneliness.
Yeah.
And people heard that and were like, same. Like that. That is really interesting.
Yeah. And this is before COVID.
And so I have a stat here from between 2001 and 2009. So way back, like before the period we're talking about. Not way back, but like, you know what I mean? 1 in 3 Australians reported an episode of loneliness between 2001 and 2009, with 40% of these people experiencing more than one episode, according to a study of loneliness using data from just household income and and that's an Australian study from 2012. So they've done this big study, and they found that there's this huge percentage of people that have really, like, properly experienced loneliness, and that's between 2001 and 2009. We have seen what has been described as an epidemic of loneliness after that. In the last, like, 3 years, like, really, even before COVID, we had this huge jump. And I don't have as much statistics and science there, but I was listening to the radio recently, and
that's a rare in itself nowadays.
Yeah, exactly right. But it was just this. It was a really interesting talkback piece, and they were talking about the rates of young women attempting suicide and hospitalizations as a result. And it was, a lot of it was anxiety driven and loneliness driven. So as these,
and further driven by social media as
fully.
well.
And so these girls were encouraged to call up, and the lady on the radio was like, I don't want any guys calling up. Just like, if you're a young woman, give us a ring. And it was amazing. I was sitting there being like, oh, how many young women are listening to the radio? And it was like, this girl called up and said, oh, I just finished my HSC. And then went on this, like, they had this conversation about all that stuff. They talked about COVID, they talked about social media, and they talked about loneliness, and they talked about all of that combining, plus all this pressure on social standing and being like the people on the internet. There's just so many factors that all play a part in this. And something that is often doing is it actually separates people from one another. In that there are so many factors like really impacting young people so much so that they are withdrawing from each other and withdrawing into themselves. Because I can sit, and I was chatting to our Brad actually on the Chip Lunch podcast, and he mentioned that something that we can do as young guys is sit on Discord for 3 hours and play video games together and not talk. So we're together, but we're really not.
Even interacting.
We're not even interacting. We're playing video games separately in the same room, in the same digital room, but not even saying a word. And you could say the same argument for that's a really cool example of
community.
Online bringing people together. And it's like, it is, but at the same time, it's
not.
It's really interesting that it's not, because it's these people are not hanging out together.
Yeah.
They're just there because they need something else to be there, someone else to be there. Like, there's just two observations.
Yeah, I think that's cool, because it's not cool hearing about that. It's more just it's cool to hear you bring that up. But I think just to go back on that point about girls increasing in self-harm and suicide rates. The
rates are insane.
There is I've actually found a couple of stats here on it. It's from a Netflix documentary from 2020, and it's actually got a sociologist by the name of Jonathan Haidt, and he's written a book called The Coddling of the American Mind. Yep. And he talks about how some people, when they're coming out of college now in the US, are struggling with dealing with actually life. Like everything's been given to them, so and the helicopter parenting and all that kind of thing have made life really hard for them. Yep. But he tracks the basically the introduction of smartphones from around 2009, and social media came onto mobile devices at around 2009, and the suicide rates for girls aged between 15 and 19 from 2009 to about 2019 have gone up 70%.
Oh my gosh.
And girls 10 to 14 has gone up 151%.
It's immense, and it's such a huge
scary
issue that that is really, really scary, and so much so that there are people all over the world trying to find different ways to solve this and react to the culture that has been created of loneliness. And one of those things that they've been trying to solve it, as Brayden mentioned earlier, that before the podcast we were chatting about, and then I gave her a little Google, but the idea that people are trying to solve the issue of loneliness by making a drug for it. So instead of creating community and like whatever, they've identified that it is something, a hormone called pregnenolone. It's a hormone produced primarily in the adrenal gland. That hormone has shown positive signs of reducing levels of anxiety, and so they are using. They're trying to get that hormone and put it into a pill to attempt to reduce.
So you just take it when you're lonely.
Yep, take it when you're sad. It's a happy pill.
I think it's interesting how, as a world, we come up with ways of addressing, like band-aiding the problem. Instead of like, we'll find a pill to make us less lonely, rather than like, well, why are we lonely?
Yeah. And just the things we try and replace, like God has set out, given us guidelines and things to take care of each other and take care of ourselves in the Bible, and just the things that we try and use instead are so interesting.
Well, I was just thinking, as Ethan was saying, like we're happy to enter a world of video gaming, which is just it's becoming more and more realistic, right? And I'm not going to demonize video games, because I like to play video games too. But when you perhaps enter a world of that video games for 3, 7, 10 hours, you're perhaps entering that world in order to address your loneliness. But supposedly you're hanging out online, but you're not even talking to each other. That, well, you're probably still band-aiding the solution. Like like where you spoke about guidelines, Brayden, I'd love you to go back and talk about like why are those guidelines important that God's given us? I feel like we've made to be relational.
Yeah.
I do really want to quickly jump in before we move on.
Go.
And say that I'm not a scientist, and so when I was saying those science words, I definitely could be wrong. There's some. I'll get Joel to link the article that I was reading that unpacks that better. And yeah, sorry, I just wanted to. I just wanted to say
and I
that.
think that's all right.
Don't go away and say that.
Another
Ethan told me. Dr. Ethan said.
And I think that's another very valid thing. Like we're talking a lot about, we're we have been talking a lot about loneliness, and we've talked about things like suicide and depression rates. And I think if you are feeling those ways, we have lots of resources that we'd love to point you out. If you want to contact any of the pastors here at Soul Revival, there's lots of resources through the Anglican Church, which is where we're a wider member of.
Yep.
Or even if you are in immediate trouble, call 000 or Lifeline as well. There's lots of options, and we're pastors. We're not experts on these type of things, but we're just looking at the culture and critiquing the culture.
Yeah.
I think, if you are really struggling with these things, there's lots of ways to reach out, and we'd love you to find help with those things.
Again, coming back to Hussey's research, he says that anxiety-related conditions were most frequently reported in a survey that he's talking about. But those 2.6 million people, or 11% of the population, have reported feeling anxious, and it probably doesn't include the people that have not reported that. But also that 8 Australians commit suicide each day, and 6 of them are men.
Yeah.
And I know that suicide is the biggest killer for men under the age of 44.
Yeah. And like you just going back to your question before that, Joel, where you were asking about the community, I think it's God has set out, blessed us with each other in the Bible, and I think that's meant to be such an important thing, that we are communal people. We're created to be in relationship with God, but also to be in relationship with each other. And I think, when we're talking about loneliness, it's such an interesting effect of the technology, and the way that we live life now is obviously very different to the way that they lived life 2,000 years ago.
Technology becomes very individualized, right?
Exactly.
So it actually makes sure that going back to that Band-Aid thing of it's individualized, so you're going to get a more individualized Band-Aid for these things. But I think what you're saying is, Brayden, I'm sorry I jumped in there.
Oh, it's all good.
But God has the ultimate solution. He doesn't have a Band-Aid solution. He has the ultimate solution.
He has the solution.
The solution.
Yeah.
And that is about being in community.
Yeah.
And he's made us all different to be introverted, extroverted, blah, blah, blah. But he's made us to be in community.
Yeah.
I think just really quickly on that, I recently read a book called On Death by Timothy Keller. It's a really, really good book, would recommend. And in conversations with that, I went into it being like, oh, maybe this is going to be a really sad, depressing read. And then I thought about it for a second before I even read it. And I realized, actually, no, there is no way a book by a Christian on death could be a consistently depressing read. And the reason for that is that it is so optimistic. Because there is so much hope. And that no matter what can happen on this earth, we have a God who is better than it all and bigger than it all and has the solutions for it all. Even death. But in particular, loneliness is God is a God of relationship and community. We see that in his very nature, as a Trinitarian God. He is relationship. He is togetherness. And so when he creates us, in Genesis, we see that, Genesis 2:18, it says it's not good for the man, Adam, to be alone. And he says, I need to make, his solution is he makes a companion for him, and it is it's such a beautiful thing that God is in control this whole time. And yes, we are tainted by sin, and thus we live in a world where loneliness happens, and thus we live in a world where death has sting.
And we're a sinful world where we sin against each other. And I think that was such a powerful thing that Michael Duckett was talking about a couple of episodes.
Massively.
And if you haven't listened to that podcast,
stop listening to this one. Go listen to
that one, because he articulates these concepts far better than I ever could, and from a far more wise perspective. Yeah. But talking about how we have restored relationship with each other only through God and only through Jesus and only through what he has done. And that is the way that we are able to relate to each other, even though some aspects of our society have done horrible things to other people. It's only through that restored relationship through Christ that we can have restored relationship with each other. That's such a powerful message.
And so as we respond to loneliness, whether it is in youth culture, or I don't think it is just youth culture at all.
I agree.
I think it is, I can come at that from that angle because that's where I kind of do a lot of my thinking. But when we respond to loneliness in culture, I think one of the greatest responses is the community that God gives us.
Yeah.
And so using that and working with that to love one another so much that we don't feel alone.
Yeah, I mean, like Jesus is building his church. We just need to partner with him
Fully.
in order to understand the community that he wants us to be part of.
Yeah.
I just want to go back to Kevin Parker quickly.
Yeah, man.
He was saying as a younger teenager, he had periods of where he felt lost and alone, where he said, I didn't have the most solid family life. I didn't have a solid base to fall back on there. So I was tackling a lot of things on my own and I was just lost. I remember thinking, I've got no one. I remember once when I was 15 or something around that age, I was brushing my teeth and I just broke down crying. I felt so alone. He also says that his 2012 album, Lonerism, validates a lot of the feelings he had as a teenager. But it also had this weird hopefulness to it. Maybe that's the charm of it. Maybe that's why it's done so well. So perhaps he's pulling these, mainly the loneliness aspect out of culture and then trying to provide a hopeful response to that. But I think that what you guys have both been saying there is that, well, we have the solution. We have the solution to the loneliness.
Yeah.
The Jesus-shaped the Jesus community that he builds around himself that we can be a part of. What I wanted to ask you, though, is we always talk about in the Shock Absorber of like, well, we know these things happen in the culture. How do we critique and embrace it, as Hussey says? And what's our response to that? We can say to people, well, God's not lonely, or God doesn't allow you to be lonely. But what is the practicality of that? How do we listen to people? Because I think that's really important. That's something that we really learnt over a number of episodes, but particularly in the Michael Duckett episode, was how do we listen to where people are at, and how do we help them to realize that Jesus doesn't want them to be alone, and his community is a real refuge for people that are feeling alone.
That's a very big question.
It's a huge question. Is there a way to rephrase that to a few words?
Okay, Kevin says in his 2010 on the 2010 album Inner Speaker, in the song Solitude is Bliss, nothing else matters, I don't care what I miss, company is okay, solitude is bliss. That's a tough question, isn't it?
So this is not just a thing that happens to Kevin. This has been a thing that's happened for a long time, and people observing culture have seen that. Joe Carter explains this phenomenon. I don't think he's given it a word, but he's looking at because loneliness is a state of mind characterized by a disassociation between what an individual wants or expects from their relationships or social interactions and what the individual experiences in their relationships or social interactions. Because loneliness is like that, people can be lonely while surrounded by others. Isolation and loneliness are not the same thing. And so we see this idea that people like in that Guardian, that thing I was reading about the pill for loneliness, they talk about loneliness as a subjective experience, is what they say there.
That's interesting.
And so you can quite easily be, because you're feeling isolated, you're not necessarily feeling alone physically, but you are isolated in the way you feel, in the way you think, in the way you expect others to be in relationship. And so even in big groups of people, we could be feeling alone.
Yeah, and so Joel quoted a song, I'll quote another song. So Kevin has a song on lonerism called Why Won't They Talk to Me? And it's pretty much all about that concept of being in a group, but the internal thought process of why don't these people want to talk to me? What's wrong with me that they don't want to communicate? And then going through that and even processing why do I even care about it? So he literally says, but why won't they talk to me? But why do I really care anyway? I wouldn't listen to a word they would say. They would just talk about themselves all day. So he's even internalizing that I don't even really want to have a conversation with these people, but yet I feel so alone because they don't want to talk to me. Which is, like I think what you're saying about being lonely in a crowd, and I think that's why Kevin's music is so popular, is he's writing about experiences that a lot of us have had.
And a lot of the artists that we've looked at over the last few episodes have talked about that duality of, and this is something we asked Ian Hussey last week, of the duality of Kanye West, for example, is a very powerful, a very wealthy individual, encourages the pursuit of consumerism, and wealth and power, but then it realizes this pursuit isn't something that isn't really going to bring full satisfaction. It might for a little bit, and that's the temptation of sin, right? It might for a little bit, but towards the end, or at some point, it's like when we're going to realize, oh, this isn't what we wanted. I think the discography of Tame Impala is also a picture of that. Of it's cool. I want to have perfect control and make my full artistic expression. If I don't have to compromise, then I don't have to be part of anyone else telling me what I need to do, and I can record my album however I want. I can record it on a computer and put all the pieces together, and I can even put it out and people will listen to it, and I can sign a record deal. Then I can get the people to play with how I want it to. But it seems like as you go on through his albums, he starts to realize, well, this is also exhausting doing this, like just making it all about me, but then also getting to the point of like being in solitude so much actually takes more energy to actually shut people out and be really, really wearing on me. So then if you look at his final album, or his last album so far in 2020, The Slow Rush, it's almost like he's dealing with, I have to get out of that. And it talks about how he became married. He got married. And in the song Is It True, which is one of my favorite songs in terms of like it's got a real nice groove to it. But in Is It True, he says, and I tell her that I'm in love with her, but how can I know that I'll always be in love with her? Yeah. So it's almost like I've moved on in my life, but I'm still trying to deal with my loneliness and that individualism of I can do whatever I want. But then, now I've entered a marriage and a relationship where it's not just me; it's a compromise. And it's not how he records his music. So how do I know if I tell her I'm in love with her now? But what if I'm not later? Like I think it calls out so much stuff in our culture of I can do everything myself. I can do whatever I want. Yeah,
and I think the Slow Rush. So right at the end of the 2010s, obviously being in 2020, but like I think we've talked a lot about the themes of loneliness, and I think the Slow Rush is such an interesting look at how time is perceived in our culture and how time is always running out. Time is finite, and you're always chasing that or looking back on that. And I think that's a lot more of interesting themes, like again addressed on that latest album, talking about that feeling, or addressing how time is
slipping away.
It's slipping away.
You can't control it.
Yeah, exactly. And that lack of control, whether I guess it's lack of control in the earlier albums talking socially, but now lack of control just in terms of time is such an interesting but big concept in today's culture. I think we were talking about apathy earlier before the podcast, and how big of a challenge that is when talking looking to evangelize. Ethan, you were saying about how apathy is one of the things that you feel like you deal with most when trying to talk to people about the gospel. Do you want to expand on that?
Well, I think it's
define for what do you mean by apathetic? Like if people are apathetic, does that mean they're just like, I don't care?
Yeah, it's pretty much that. It's just this big culture of I really don't care what you have to say, and I don't care what God has effect on my life, what effect God has on my life,
and I don't care what other people think, but
because it's that you do you mentality that you were just chatting about. Like,
but the funny thing is, the flip side of that is like I actually do care what everyone else thinks, and that's why I have that apathetic nature.
Yeah, of course, and it's this idea of like I think it would almost be easier. It is easier when people are opposed to me when I am attempting to evangelize, because when they are opposed to me, they're thinking about it. When they are apathetic to it and they just don't care, there is just this really, like you can see the glaze, and then it's like, yeah, cool. Like your opinion's sick. But that's your opinion. and I am going to do my own thing.
But the lack of engagement with any kind
Fully.
of opinion
Yeah.
or thought process
Yeah.
is showing that there's not really any development of it's delaying. It's also almost like delaying that. Like, I don't want to, there's a talk about how the adolescent in we delay adolescence, especially in young men growing up, because like it's just like, well, you just celebrate who you are and be who you want to be forever. But then it seems like something that Kevin's pulling out is that, well, that can lead to isolation and loneliness.
Yeah, and so I think something that's really interesting about this whole isolation and loneliness discussion paired with all that is that God comes in with that solution, and that's where all of this kind of arrives to. Like, we can talk about the fact that the culture is like, and the problem with the apathy is that when you can say, okay, what's your problem? And they say, oh, my problem is loneliness. The apathy is hard when you can say, oh, I have the solution to that.
I want to chat to you about it.
I want to chat to you about that. Like, we can fix this. Like, we can't fix this, but I know who can.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis famously once said that we can ignore even pleasure, but pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And we are living in a deaf world. And when we see this pandemic of loneliness, for lack of a better word,
Epidemic.
Epidemic, yeah. This particular, like, loneliness is a particular form of suffering. And I'm just reading on this thing that I found a little while ago, was that this particular form of suffering, loneliness, drives a person to God, because in the midst of our isolation, there is, or feels as though there is, no one left to turn to except God.
Yeah.
And so we can, I think, something we can talk about in the Shock Absorber podcast is how to do church to help, and how to build community to help people be in a community together, and that thus solve loneliness. But I think that as much as we do that, like as much as God builds that community through us and through our relationships with one another, at the end of the day, maybe what some people need is they need to be able to call to God and break through that apathy and see, actually, I have no one and I have nothing, but God's there and he loves me and he wants to be in a relationship with me. And then in that relationship with God, you realize, oh, actually, I am surrounded by all these people at church. Or I can get myself surrounded by all these people at church. And then we are able to go, how do we build that community with one another to combat these issues practically?
Because it's like the apathy is a result of not wanting to experience suffering. So if you don't want to engage, if they're apathetic about even talking about God or Jesus or anything like that, it's, well, if I have to engage in that, if I have to think about it, if I have to challenge those supposed societal pressures of be yourself, do whatever you want, that's hard.
Yeah.
That's hard. Like, I engage in a society, and especially people younger than yourselves. I mean, an entire society dominated by the internet has told me you can watch whatever video you want, play whatever video game you want, whenever you want, whatever time, all that kind of stuff. That's easy. Yeah. When you have to engage in a conversation about something being hard, it's hard.
Yeah.
But again, as your C.S. Lewis quote points to, we need to suffer as Christians because that's where we are. Like, God talks about refining us by fire.
But it's also the only time we listen.
Yes,
like,
it can be the only time we listen.
It can be the only time we listen. Like, it says there that, like, God whispers to us through our pleasures. Like, he's there in our pleasures.
Yeah, and he's the one giving us the pleasures.
And he's like, all of that is we are getting, like, oh my gosh, God, you are so good that I have got X or I've got Y. Like, I'm getting married in January, and I'm so stoked about that. And part of why I'm so stoked is because I reckon my wife is really cool. And
future wife.
My future wife is really cool. And that is a really cool experience to have as a relationship. But at the same time, like, it's so easy to then forget that God is the reason that all happened.
Our pleasures, like the pleasurable stuff, leads us to think we've done it on our own.
Yeah, fully, massively. And I think what is really interesting is that alongside that need for pain and potential need for loneliness, God uses that, right? But throughout the Bible, we see examples of loneliness. So we have Naomi, we have David, for example. David has heaps of psalms about loneliness while he was on the run, and we have, they're just two good examples of Naomi, for example, was given Ruth. God was like, here you go, like you do need a person, and same with David. David got out of that situation and was not isolated for the whole time, and we see in Hebrews that we are encouraged to never give up meeting together, because that is what we are called to do, and that is the community that we've been given by God. Like, as much as loneliness may end up being important or may be used as a tool, God is giving us so much in church or in relationships that He is providing. It's quite amazing.
I mean, there's a quote from that I found from a writer called Josh Terry, and that was in Vice in 2010. And he talks about Tame Impala. He said, Tame Impala is the artist of the decade for the 2010, where he wrote, no artist captured how genres cross-pollinated throughout the 2010s better than Tame Impala. But then he goes on to add, in the age of streaming and the big box festival bubble, Parker's discography seems factory-made for both a crowd of thousands and a chill night alone with a vibe-heavy playlist. And that his music embodies the technology-driven sense of loneliness of this decade better than any of his peers. I think there's a really good way to sum up Tame Impala's impact on the culture, or perhaps Tame Impala reflecting the culture. Brayden, as a Tame Impala fan, having this conversation, does that change your opinion of Kevin, or perhaps that he's actually a very good cultural artifact that actually reflects what's going on and helps us decide whether we embrace or critique?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing and an interesting question you can ask with lots of secular artists. I think he's very musically talented.
True, that's very
taking away lyrical content. He, as he said, he can write a catchy groove. He can certainly is very melodically talented and technically musically talented. But yeah, I think lyrically and culturally, he's just espousing what is a very popular cultural belief at the moment. I think
a cultural experience.
It resonates with a lot of people for a reason, because a lot of people feel like that.
Yep.
And I think it's our responsibility as the church to, again, embrace or critique that culture. And as Hussey said, so I think I'm still a fan of his music. I think he writes catchy music and good music. Am I going to say that it's music that will help you in your Christian walk? Probably not. But most music is like that. So, I think that's a interesting but probably a completely different conversation.
That's cool, but I think it's been a really good way of looking into what we face perhaps in Australian culture, because that's where the road we're going to head down with looking at Australian artists now that we've looked at Australian culture with Ian Hussey. Ethan, any final thoughts on perhaps loneliness, isolation, and where we could go in terms of listening?
I think that this is a really, really cool opportunity to react to the culture. In that we are seeing a world that is really suffering, and we have the only message that will get rid of that, or that can combat that, and that can really shine a light into this loneliness. And I think there's this interesting duality of the answer being us, but also the answer being God. And it is all God, but it is also, we're the only ones who are going to create communities that people can come into and realize that they're not alone. I think it is a really, really beautiful thing. And the reason I brought up that On Death book was because I want to talk about how, like, we have been talking about some really heavy stuff the whole time on this podcast, but it is so easy to talk about how heavy this is, but at the very end of that, throw into, no, but it's okay. Like, and because God's got it. And I think that we need to be able to try and live that out with the people that we're ministering to, and the people that we're sharing the gospel with.
I feel like we can, through being inspired by God's love, we can embrace the people that are feeling lonely, but critique the reasons that they are lonely.
Massively.
Yeah. And I think that's what Jesus allows us to do. It's a good way to finish, guys.
Very good way
I
to finish.
think. Thank you very much for your time today.
No problem.
On the Shock Absorber podcast. It's been very, very fun.
Yeah.
We should say we are wearing quite a few pieces of Soul Revival apparel. Well, Ethan and I are. I've got the Shock Absorber shirt on. He's got the Soul Revival shirt on. We've got the Love God Love Others hat on. If you're interested in that, guys, visit. Zoomed in right in the camera. Visit soulrevival.shop to check that out. And you can also catch other podcasts like the Chip Lunch podcast, where we talk about people from Soul Revival Church talking about their Christian walk and how they became Christians. You guys are on that podcast too, aren't you?
We are.
Occasionally.
Occasionally. Yeah,
Once or
that's
twice.
right. But let's keep talking about this. If you've got any comments, chuck it in the Discord. You can email me at joel@shockabsorber.com.au. We want to keep talking about this. We're going to make a real effort towards having greater conversations around this after each episode. So if you want to get involved in that, jump on the Discord, or we can ask questions during the podcast. Also put questions via email, like I said.
Especially with a point like this. Like, we have not even scratched the surface.
Yes,
like, really.
completely.
Like, this is such a huge, and there's so many other facets and layers. And I think, like, maybe because I'm new, but I'm feeling, it's like I've got this underlying level of anxiety being like, oh, I haven't covered everything. And there's there's niches to the things I've said.
Everything.
Like, nuances to the things I've said. But like, we
very
want to continue.
individualist of you.
Well, but no, it's actually it was a thought of, wanting to get it right. But we were never, like, it's not going to be this, because this is a conversation, as is mental health, which we talk about often. It is a conversation to be had, not just a quick fix.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the point of the Shock Absorber. Listening to the younger Christians, they're at the cold face of cultural change, and we have slightly older Christians or even older Christians who can help us deal with that through their biblical wisdom. So I really appreciate your time, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for listening and or watching. We really appreciate it, and we'll finish up with a one way.
One way.